Peter Foster, I'm a policy editor at the Financial Times. Welcome to this Green Alliance event, the culmination of 3 years of work looking at how we need to green the tax system as we approach net zero, or we try and approach net zero. Covers a wide range of areas from housing policy, road pricing, carbon border adjustment mechanisms. It's a massive web, like all net zero things, a massive web and a complex web, which is often in the media guilty as charged, often reported in silos, not reported in a particularly joined up and holistic way, and it may well be the case in Whitehall as well. We've got an amazing panel to try and unpack what is a pretty thorny subject, and we're going to start with Libby Peake here, who has run the Transform Tax project for the Green Alliance. She spent 10 years as an environmental publisher at Resource Media, and like me, she is a graduate of English literature, which is always a good thing to be. Chris Stark doesn't need much introduction as the boss of the Climate Change Committee. That's the statutory body that was formed in 2008 to keep the government honest on net zero, and has been a really visible and actually a brilliant resource as a journalist. I don't know which government came up with that, but having somebody whose literally job is to speak their mind when ministers are bloviating and dodging and ducking and diving is a wonderful thing. Before taking on this life, Chris was a Whitehaller in Treasury and in Baines. And then, last but not least, Jill Rutter, who needs no introduction, probably the country's foremost expert insider on Whitehall, the machinery of government, and what's really going on in Whitehall. She is a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, the UK and the Change in Europe, King's College London, all of that. But she's also, I didn't know this, and I thought I knew everything about Jill, she is an advisor to the National Infrastructure Commission on net zero. Get that on. Right, we're going to start with Libby. Libby is going to just explain about the Transform Tax Programme and what we mean by greening the tax system. So, Libby, over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for coming out tonight to talk about tax. The Transform Tax project actually grew out of some research we did with the University of Cardiff, which looked into the changes that how people felt about the changes that we need to see to have a resource efficient and low carbon economy. And people were really on board with the idea that we should have a resource efficient, low carbon economy, and they were really quite enthusiastic about those changes that would not really require much of a change from them and could just sort of deliver them better products at lower prices. But then when you started asking them about the more fundamental transformational changes that we're likely to need, there was more resistance. They didn't really like the changes that were proposed to housing, to transport. They were actually asked about carbon allowances or material allowances and really didn't like that. But the one exception was the idea that the tax system could change, and you could use the tax system to sort of reverse the incentive that people see at the moment, which is that they feel like they're being penalised often for doing the right things. And so the idea that the tax system could shift and incentivize better decisions for the environment was really quite attractive. I don't think they were really enthusiastic about it at the time, but it looked like there was scope. And so we thought that we should investigate that and see how we could use that to deliver net zero and the resource efficient economy. And so we put in a proposal to the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and they have been generously funding this project for the past 3 years. And I have to admit that after they first awarded us this money, I had a bit of a wobble, and I thought, oh my God, now I have to spend the next 3 years thinking about tax, which is, I'm an English graduate, it's not my natural home. But I think in the end, I feel like I have been fully vindicated in researching this for the past 3 years and for learning just how fundamental this is to achieving our goals and how poorly it's being used at the moment. And so following on from some of the research that we did with the University of Cardiff, we did some more research, we did some citizens' assemblies and some polling to find out a bit more about people feel about different options for greening the tax system. And people were really enthusiastic about it. We did it during lockdown. We had different groups in rural Wales, in suburban Manchester, and in urban Bristol, and they were gung ho about changing the tax system. And I was reading through. It's actually, some of you might have it on your seat. They're randomly in this one, the greener tax system, the People's Verdict. Someone actually says, "I love the idea of greening VAT," and love was not something I thought was going to be expressed about tax when I started this project. And actually, they were sort of won over by the arguments for the various different options that we presented them with. So we talked about greening the VAT system, which was the most popular option. We also talked about material taxes and carbon taxes, and we talked about road pricing, and we can get into whether or not that is actually greening the tax system, but I think that it certainly does fall in that category. And they were keen on all of them in the end, although I think we put it euphemistically in the report that the road pricing inspired the most lively debate. And the people in Bristol, I think the notable thing is the people in Bristol hated it most, and Bristol has really poor public transport. People in Manchester really quite like the sound of it, and Manchester has really good public transport. And so one of the things that shows us is that if you get the conditions right, it makes it easier to change the system in a way that will be acceptable to the public. And so they also did talk to us about different things that they would want to see in order for them to accept these changes. And they were largely around fairness. They wanted the tax changes to enable them to do the right thing, not to punish them. They wanted it to be effective and not necessarily a money spinner, which could be a problem when it comes to getting buy-in from the Treasury. And they wanted to be transparent. They wanted it to be sort of part of a transparent, overarching program of government, which is something that we've been looking at a lot in this project as well. Tax is a powerful tool that's barely been yielded, but it does need to be viewed as part of a wider, coherent approach to net zero and greening and nature's recovery. So I think we saw there was a lot of widespread support for it from the public, but it feels like there's nowhere near as much support from the government or appetite from within government to take on this challenge. And over the course of the project, there have actually been a couple of really big damning reports that have been issued by influential organisations, including the National Audit Office, which said, I've got some quotes written down, the Treasury had limited insight into the environmental impact and identified at least 5 tax reliefs that are actively working against the net zero carbon goals and other environmental aims, and costing the Treasury 17 billion a year. And then the Public Accounts Committee report was even more damning, and it said that the Treasury officials could not even explain to us clearly how the tax system is used in achieving the government's environmental goals. And I think that lack of understanding is really key, because all tax measures can have an environmental impact, and we're not measuring them. We're often not measuring them very effectively or coherently for environmental taxes, and certainly not for other taxes that have an environmental impact but aren't designated as environmental taxes. To be fair to Treasury, and there might be some Treasury people in today, and I do want to be fair to them, there have been some changes, and there have been some positive things that they could potentially build on. Over the course of the project as well, they did issue the net zero review and the descriptive review into the economics of biodiversity. And those two both provided sort of glimmers of what could change and how it could change. And the net zero review in particular, so the descriptive review sort of wasn't targeted at Treasury, it wasn't targeted at policy. And so for that reason, it feels like, although it showed that we must incorporate the impacts on biodiversity into the tax system, into our economic system, it didn't necessarily show the way how. I've got some colleagues in the room who are doing a follow-on project who will be looking into how the descriptive review can be translated into policy, so I think that's absolutely what's needed. And then the net zero review did sort of change the tone and say, accept the logic that you need to invest now to prevent problems in the future, but it didn't really set out a clear vision for how that's going to happen. And so a lot of what we were doing in the later years, we're looking at the cases, the need for a roadmap to net zero taxes. We need to set out a coherent plan that's going to look at how all of these different taxes are going to work together and to work with the other levers that government has in its arsenal that it can pull to get us to net zero. I think I'll probably leave it there, but we've got a long way to go, and I'm really looking forward to getting stuck in to the conversation.
Okay, it's a great start. I have one very quick supplementary. Is when you were focus grouping all those people, was it premised on the idea that the net tax burden would be the same. I never quite buy focus groups because people don't really know what they think about tax, so they're asked to pay it. But was it clear that the net tax burden from greening the system would be the same? So it would be about transferring.
It wasn't always. So we provided them with different options. Although the greening VAT one, which was the most popular, did say that prices for some things would go up, and that would be balanced by the prices for some things going down. And they liked that.
What does greening VAT mean exactly?
So some of our initial research was looking at, so VAT is the UK's tax on consumption, and so it is a really important driver in purchasing habits. And there are some current perversities in it that are driving environmental problems. Like at the moment, if we want to talk about housing, new build housing has zero rate VAT on it, but retrofitting and refurbishment, which is the environmentally desirable one, has a 20% VAT, and so that encourages you to destroy houses and build new ones and not to preserve the materials.
So back really to encourage green behaviour. Okay, brilliant. Right, Chris, you're the captain of Net Zero. It doesn't seem to be going terribly well, judging by your recent reports. Tell us a little bit about where we are, but also the extent to which you think the tax system can be used to get closer to where you'd like to be, or like us to be.
Great, I can do that. And say thank you very much for coming along tonight to hear this, and to Libby for all the great work that she's done. I love tax. So I started my career working on tax policy in what was then the inland revenue, and then moved into the Treasury to do it. And Jill and I were just talking about that. I was in a very small team called the tax policy team, which was a misnomer actually. It was the sort of tax wrangling team, and we had a brilliant time kind of looking across all the taxes and looking at the potential to change the tax system. I've since gone off and done other things. I mostly worked in corporate tax, but I'm really keen to come and speak to you about this thing, because one of the things I believe absolutely passionately is we're going to have to draw in the discussion of what to do about tax policy into this discussion about net zero, and indeed some other things that we need to do across the country. And it's with that in mind, I think, that I'm going to slightly kind of push against this framing of this. Actually, it's not really about greening the tax system. I think if I can encourage you tonight to think slightly differently about it. There's kind of three things I wanted to say. First is that net zero is happening. So, the point of the Climate Change Act is to force the pace of it, but there is a movement towards a lower carbon economy happening around us, and I think we should be viewing that as a fundamental of the future now. So it's a fundamental shift from the perspective of the tax base. So I know that the Treasury will have lots of work going on right now on this very topic, but the kind of moment to have the real public discussion is now upon us. And quite deliberately, you've got a government in waiting. We may have a returning government, but the next parliament is going to have to confront some of this. So this kind of idea that net zero is ancillary is a thing I think we should challenge. It should be viewed, I think, as an inevitability, part because we've got a legal goal on it, but also because it's happening globally. When you do that, that opens up with much greater clarity the fiscal risks that come with it. So they're big, of the order of 40, 50, maybe even more billion per year of revenue rests ultimately on the fact that we've got a tax system that was built understandably around a high carbon economy, because that's the way economies work. So as this transition takes place, we should think more about the inevitability of a lower carbon.
Is that 40, 50 billion, that's just fossil fuel taxes?
Fossil fuel taxes, so you can think of fuel duties, the big ones, that's something of the order of 30, but then you've got all the other North Sea taxes, and there's other things in there too, VED, those sorts of things. So, actually working out how much is at stake is a really important aspect of this, but it's a big number, so there's that. So that's kind of point one. The second point I wanted to make is a kind of question, I suppose. Should therefore, in the knowledge that it's happening, should we be using the tax system proactively to drive the transition? And I think that's an open question. You would expect me to say yes to that, and I believe it to be something that we should be doing. But the Treasury's got to answer that question, and it hasn't really so far. So it's slightly ducked those issues in the past. We've always had environmental taxes in various forms, and we can debate the meaning of environmental taxes, but we have things like the climate change levy. You can look at, we've talked about some of them, VED, those sorts of things, APD, fuel duty. They're not really environmental taxes, they're revenue raisers usually, but the point here is we are at the point now where they might actually have a behavioural response. So that is something we're going to have to think through. We've also got things like the ETS, the carbon pricing regime we have in the UK is quite a novel one. It's worked very well to drive decarbonisation in the power sector, but also to raise cash. It's a key lever in some fundamentals, and you just mentioned consumption taxes, Libby. That for me is the next bit. So in terms of skewing the kind of net zero story towards making choices easier for people and businesses in this economy, tax is a completely fundamental lever that we haven't really used so far. And I can imagine a way in which you would do that. So one of the key things for us in this transition is that we've started amazingly well to produce this low carbon electricity that we now need to be using more extensively in the economy. You could use the tax system to skew the incentive towards using cheaper electricity that is generated from low carbon sources and away from using fossil fuels. But it's a hard decision, and you've got to do that. Which takes me kind of, I suppose, to the final point I wanted to make is that how we should handle this is really fundamental, because in this net zero transition, we're going to see some big distributional impacts, which if we don't reform the tax system with it, will be greatly amplified. So there are very deep and very problematic unfairnesses already in the system as we decarbonise. Basically, if you're if you're rich enough to remove yourself from some of the costs that people experience today from high cost of fossil fuels, for example, it's not been a bad 18 months for you. If you can afford your Tesla, plug it in at home, play with time of day tariffs, insulate your home, this has not been a difficult period.
And the danger is that if you end up equalising that tax system, you only do it when everyone's having to buy an electric car.
Exactly that. So you've got this kind of inherent problem already, which potentially the tax system will exacerbate if we don't reform it, plus these fiscal risks. And I think distributional analysis, as it's sometimes called in the trade, is absolutely the Treasury's core aim in this. They're going to do it. They've scratched the surface of this with the net zero review. But looking ahead at how you handle that is a fundamental concern, I think. And given my earlier first point that net zero is an inevitability, I think there's an inevitability to looking properly at the fairness of the tax system in this transition. Which takes me to my very, very final point, which is if you were really, all over this, what you will want to do is take your time, spell out a set of reforms that play out over a long period with a strategic aim at their core, acknowledging that net zero is one of the aims that the economy needs to pull off, but also a set of other things that need to play out, and reforming the taxes in such a way that you don't amplify those fairnesses and actually come out to a better fairness outcome at the end of it. We have been historically terrible at doing that sort of tax reform. And I don't see a world where you get elected on that ticket. It's never a popular thing, but I do think that's the way we've got to look at it. And the kind of best expression of why this is now becoming more and more problematic is that if you pick off individual issues, we've just seen an issue, for example, with the hydrogen levy that was proposed on, through some means for consumers to help pay for the low carbon hydrogen that we'll need in this transition. If you pick that off individually, it's an impossible political challenge. You need to discuss what you're doing in the round as you decarbonise to support that kind of proposal, if that's the right proposal at all. So, fuel duty, whether to move to road pricing, those sorts of things, they have to be discussed in the strategic sense, and we're very bad at doing that.
We'll come on to some of the detail of that. When you look at some of the big challenges, I'm thinking, social care, we've known we've got to do something like that for donkeys. There are lots of, big challenges which we're politically really ill-equipped to get to. Jill, that brings me to you really. We're politically ill-equipped, I think we know that. Obviously the machinery of government is in the hands of the politicians, so this is a kind of double-edged piece for you really. But when you look at that, quite depressing set of precedents really on being strategic, particularly at the moment in the face of all sorts of really difficult pressures on cost of living, on mortgage, on energy, etc. When you look and survey across Whitehall, how are we going to get there?
Thanks, Peter. Sort of easy start. So first of all, I'm going to ignore Peter's question because I'm a well-trained Treasury former Director of Communications. We produced lots of reports at the Institute for Government in conjunction with the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Chartered Institute for Taxation, saying we need to talk more about tax in this country. We don't talk enough about tax, and tax debates are incredibly ill-informed. And that sort of means it's very difficult to talk about reforming taxes because people actually don't understand the current system of taxation. So can I first of all pay tribute to Libby and to Green Alliance for talking to people about tax and putting tax out there. I want to pick up on some of the things that Chris said and link it then to the question Peter asked. Peter will be relieved to hear. So is the Treasury going to give up its monopoly on tax policy? Probably not. That is, I think you could say, sort of one of the axioms of the Treasury is, tax off our lawn, we do tax. The Treasury, I think, is quite interesting, so I'm just going to give you a bit of an insight, and if there are Treasury colleagues in the room who would like to challenge on this, please do this under cover of anonymity or whatever, and Peter will absolutely not report anything in the Financial Times. But if we look at the Treasury mindset, what's the Treasury mindset? So the Treasury did make some forays into greening tax policy, at least it thought it did. So none of you in the audience, prospect section of the Director of Green Alliance, are probably old enough to remember the Treasury's sort of attempted outing into doing this when Norman Lamont was Chancellor in the halcyon days and decided that he would make a perfectly sensible tax policy move, which was to apply the standard rate of VAT to domestic fuel and power. I was in number 10 at the time. I'd been running the predecessor of Chris's tax policy team in the Treasury, called fiscal policy team, but no number 10, despite the fact I did environment, decided to tell me in advance that Treasury was planning to do that. People in number 10 knew, I hold them very guilty as well. The Treasury expected to get a whole bunch of plaudits for a green move. They needed to raise revenue because they were rebuilding public finances after Black Wednesday. They expected green groups all to laud this great move to green the tax system. The tax policy lasted a week. Friends of the Earth did put their heads above the parapet and say this is a good move before they realised that was not going with the consensus, and then they ducked very rapidly below the parapet again. And that was why we ended up with domestic fuel and power stuck first at 8% because the government couldn't push through its move to uprate. Then VAT was at 15%. This was a long time ago, guys. And Gordon Brown, when he became Chancellor, made his absolute first move to take it down to the minimum reduced rate you could do of 5% because it was perceived to be so popular. Big message to the Treasury is whatever people say out there, branding a tax rise as green does not make it a popular tax rise. Contrast that really interestingly with the reliable revenue raising that is cigarette duty, where actually, time and again, I actually got the Treasury to start saying we were doing it for health reasons as opposed to pure revenue reasons, on grounds it wasn't really that justifiable to do it otherwise, it's a tax on very poor people. But, learned behaviour is this does not pay. Ditto when Gordon Brown came in and adopted a policy that had been floated before the election by the Institute of Public Policy Research, to what was called a green tax switch, taxing bads, climate change emissions, reducing goods, taxes on employment, so they introduced tax on emissions, used it to reduce employer national insurance contributions. Again, completely lost, no bonus points or whatever. So learned Treasury behaviour is frankly, the sort of people who talk about greening the tax system as a way of helping Treasury objectives, which are mainly about raising revenue in the most politically acceptable way, and that is the fundamental purpose of the tax system, is that actually doing the green right thing doesn't actually pay politically. So that's the thing. More thoughts about the Treasury mindset. Treasury is not really a team player. Treasury suffers from a case of Treasury exceptionalism, and the Treasury is, you're much more imprinted as a Treasury official than you are as a duckling. I still think of myself as a Treasury person. I haven't worked there for decades, but I still see myself as a Treasury person because the mindset is so strong. And part of that team player is that you don't really want to commit tax which is yours to a collective effort. And that's really difficult because the discussion you should be having is what role does tax play alongside the other instruments A lot of departments will come to you with their demands to do things through tax, because that means they don't have to do it through spending, which comes out of their budgets. Lots of other people think it's an easy, quick win to do things through the tax system. The Treasury very much sees that as keep off, this is ours, go away. The Treasury, Chris set out the sort of view of a tax strategy, tax roadmaps. The Treasury is commitment phobic. It absolutely does not like to tie its hands in advance. So, with notable exceptions, the corporation road tax map was, the corporation tax roadmap was a notable exception, but it doesn't do that. The other thing is, tax is highly political. Highly political. Why has fuel duty been frozen since 2009, with the one exception in the year in which Rishi Sunak cut it? Because people don't think you could get through it back through the House of Commons, even with a majority of 80. That's why people call Robert Halfon the most expensive MP in the House of Commons, because Robert Halfon and his fleet of Essex white van men will come and see you down. So it's really seen as politically very difficult. But, as Chris says, the case you need to be making is there are some very big decisions on tax you absolutely can't duck, and that the Treasury has to be in the forefront leading on, of which the biggest one is what are you going to do about the facts that you are about to lose on government declared policy, the revenue from fuel duty, fossil fuels over time. How are you going to replace that? And that is a challenge both to Jeremy Hunt and to Rachel Reeves. And frankly, they ought to come together and commission a review to be available to either of them. They need to get that adapted. The Treasury needs to think, and I think was getting there before the pandemic, then blown off course, to realise that actually the transition to net zero is the biggest economic game out there, and that the Treasury needs to play a leading role in ensuring that is done at least cost. And least cost means that you allow the tax system to play its role in that transition.
It's an interesting and depressing overview. I mean, you could, devil's advocate, Jill, going back to Norman Lamont's day and saying, there's no brownie points for greening the tax system. Well, that's rather at odds with what Libby's found in her focus groups, right? It is an intensely political world. You could cast road taxes or road pricing, right? With why are we giving all these fat cats driving Teslas tax breaks when you, white van man, are at the pump pouring money into the exchequer every time that you do that. So I guess my question, I guess to Libby maybe, is like taking a positive view, where are the wins here? Where can we start a different conversation where actually greening the tax system is not only sort of good for the planet, but actually going to be good for the economy? Because obviously, the politics means you've got to sell this stuff. Are there any kind of wins out there? And then maybe, Chris, you can take that one up as well, because it seems to me we ain't going to get to the net zero target unless we find a way to kind of move the discussion on from where Jill rightly says it's been stuck for a long time.
I think possibly some of the easier wins that won't be so politically fraught are to do with things that won't affect people so much. Because I do think that there's a framing you could use on potentially increasing VAT, which it's not the time to do it right now, but you could say that the VAT, the reduction in VAT, actually most of the benefit of that accrues to the wealthy because they spend a lot more money, like they have the Tesla, they spend a lot more money on gas, so they're getting a much bigger discount than the poor people. And if you use that actually as part of the package and figured out how to redistribute it, there have been academic studies that show that actually most people who are on the lower income deciles can be better off. So again, it would be in those sort of consumer-facing ones, ensuring that you're not just issuing the tax, but also covering the other problems that might be brought in by the tax. But another approach that might be useful for the next government to take is to, first of all, not target the consumer-facing taxes, certainly not now in a cost of living crisis, but to look more at what you could do to ensure businesses are making the right investments, businesses are paying their fair share of tax. Like how can you make the windfall tax an actual windfall tax so that Shell and BP actually aren't making record profits at the time, and then use that money to drive the other things that you want to see. I mean, one environmental tax that they have successfully escalated is one that people don't say anything about it. It's the landfill tax, and there are problems with the landfill tax. But in terms of escalating from, I think it started on £2.10 in 1997. It's now approaching £200 a tonne for every tonne of waste that you put in landfill. And most people probably haven't thought ever about the landfill tax. It's just actually delivered money for the Treasury. So certainly, and we have another report out today on carbon taxes, and again, those aren't levied on people, they're not consumer-facing ones, so those might be the easier ones to start with. And then you can start a wider discussion about the consumer-facing taxes that also need to change.
Yeah, because I mean, the business environment is really tough. I was just spent the last 2 days in the Midlands listening to business, absolutely screaming blue murder about why UK industrial energy prices are so much higher than Europe, squeezing their margins. There's a survey that was out by the British American Chamber which showed that the rise in corporation tax is, the least popular thing among US investment. Business investment is in the toilet at the moment, has been since 2008. It's a tough time to be larding tax on business. I mean, Chris, where do you think the learned behaviour that Jill describes in the Treasury, given the politics, where do you think the little footholds are that maybe that we can start to turn this discussion around?
So I think there's lots of ways into this. I think the fiscal risk argument is definitely the clearest one, because you've got a problem that's got to be fixed. I think the other, just to speak to the psychology of the organisation that Jill reports, my experience of working with the Treasury in it and since outside it is that the Treasury responds best when it has a thing to fix. So it's a sort of problem-fixing organisation. So you present it in that way that only they can fix it, then you get into a more interesting discussion about it. I'm not sure there's any easy wins here, but I do think reframing it. So one of the interesting things in the net zero transition generally is that there are lots of things that we need people and businesses to do that they don't presently do that could be cheaper. And framing it in that way is often a politically salient way to get this done. So I mentioned the electricity thing, for example. You want people to use electricity not because it's green. My experience, for what it's worth, of putting green in front of things is it generally does just turn people off. So you actually presenting this just as a way of making electricity and the electrification of the British economy cheaper is a good way into that. The counter to that is you're going to have to do something on the dirty stuff as well. So yeah, that's the difficult politics there. But again, a good politician would own that.
I mean, to what extent do you fear that in the febrile political world that we live in, that we're going to end up in a world where, as you say, people aren't just switched off, they're genuinely have animosity towards net zero. Net zero makes you poorer. Net zero means you can't compete. All of those arguments. China doesn't even do much about net zero. They seem to be. How close are we, do you think, to losing the argument, and what do we need to do to make sure on something that is as politically sensitive as tax, that it doesn't backfire the laudable ambition to green the tax system? As you say, we shouldn't really split green tax at all. The system, the air is tax, right? What's the danger, do you think, that we start to lose the argument?
So I think you've seen a definite chilling of the discussion of net zero in the last year and more. And I suppose partly there's an inevitability to that. My own view, I think we're quite far away from a rejection of net zero. I mean, there's a reason why, politicians of all creeds and colours choose to support it. People do want to see this stuff happen. My worry with the tax stuff is this is the kind of thing that would turn people off. So you've got this very real discussion playing out. And I suppose for me, when you stand back from net zero, one of the very clear things is it requires a lot of capital investment. It's a very capital intensive thing. So you do need investment. And then you get this win at the end of it, which is that in investing in these capital assets that are decarbonised, using them is cheaper. So there's a sort of story there that you can play with a bit. But the overall cost of it, therefore, is low. But within that, you've got this really skewed thing where you've got certain bits of the economy where it's very, net zero itself is saving the economy as you move towards it. And in other bits, notably what you do in buildings, big costs. So I go back to my earlier point, I think there has to be some attempt by the government to explain what it's doing across those things. And my own experience of this, I've worked in a few things now, we've actually been spoken to people about that. When they see the package they're much more supportive of difficult things. And it's not just the tax system. So I think you're drawing in the idea that some of the taxes will change alongside other things. We need to talk about things like obligations and duties and regulations that go with it. If you are able to explain that as a package, it's much easier. But politicians typically have not done that on this kind of.
It's interesting. I was on a panel not that long ago, which was talking about greening the investment climate, and they made exactly the same point that you just made at the start of this discussion, which is that green taxes shouldn't be something that's on the fringes or on the edges. The entire system needs greening. Jill, we now have a net zero minister in the form of Grant Shapps, the net zero ministry. Seems to be some discussion in Whitehall about what that does or doesn't do in terms of seniority or pecking order around the cabinet table of the net zero discussion. I mean, on paper, it sort of looks good. I'm interested in your thoughts, and then we're going to go to questions. So Mike's at the ready, but I'm interested in your thoughts while the audience thinks of some questions to test you with. On whether the changes in the machinery of government, in your view, point to progress, point to possibility, or just more chaos and confusion?
Well, normally machinery of government changes on their own don't actually solve any problems. They tend to transfer problems around the system rather than solve them. That said, it's very clear talking to people who are working in the new Department of Energy Security Net Zero, many of whom are former people from the Department of Energy and Climate Change, which effectively has just been plucked back out of the business department, that many of them sort of are quite pleased to get their identity back and are quite pleased to have a senior Secretary of State. And it's interesting that Grant Shapps chose that from coming out of the business department. He chose to go to the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, senior Secretary of State who can be a voice for climate in the cabinet. The cabinet, of course, never discusses tax matters. So, if you're just looking at does that make a difference on the balance of power and tax, no. But they do like that. Does it solve the general net zero coordination problem in government? I don't think so, because it's quite difficult to coordinate cross-government strategies really effectively from what is a line department with direct responsibility. So it does bring back the focus. It does mean you've got a quite strong voice there for all of those. But I just want to pick up on one point on tax reform, which is the sort of, having a big narrative, doing some pitch rolling of rather than just resort to the rabbit and hope you can get your rabbit, boxed in and in the hutch before, as you thrash through the finance bill. Build a narrative, explain to people what you're doing, and putting together a package, all in various other areas, are actually the way of doing sort of big reforms. I mean, tell people what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it's going to yield the necessary results at the end of the day. And going back to the VAT on fuel and power, the conversation I had was, if you'd told me or the Environment Department that you were doing this, we'd have said, take some of the proceeds and do something about the UK's lamentable record on energy efficiency and fuel poverty, and then you might find you've got a rather bigger constituency for this move than you're expecting to get just for the tax move in isolation.
Yeah, I mean, the Green Homes grant was a catastrophe, wasn't it? It was a disaster. I mean, do you think when you look at, say, the internal Whitehall discussion on carbon border taxes, you sort of get the impression that Kemi Badenoch has rather marginalised Grant Shapps, and you've got Kemi's people briefing that, Shappsy thinks he's got a promotion, but actually they've just put him out to grass. And, given the interlinkage between industry and carbon and energy and net zero, making it a kind of isolated thing, maybe going, Chris, back to your point about the fact that we need to not silo the question on tax. What's your view, Chris, on siloing the net zero ministry?
So I think you've picked out a couple of really interesting areas. So I'm a fan of the new department. I think it's good to have a sort of slightly slimmer department that is focused on net zero issues, and especially energy issues. The energy issues still drive most of the net zero agenda. But interestingly, you touched on carbon border adjustments. So the idea of tax at the border. And the other thing is ETS. This question of whether you might link the ETS, for example, to the EU scheme. And what's interesting about having created a slim department is that you sort of slightly lose your capacity to influence these really fundamental tax policies or fundamental policies, full stop, because they vest somewhere else. I think that's inevitable, and I think that it's basically a feature of the fact that net zero is so big. You know, it's a completely fundamental, just as Jill said, fundamental shift in the way the economy works. So this thing will only ever work if you've got a cabinet that is broadly not just supporting it, but thinking through fundamentally what policies in every bit of Whitehall, literally every bit of Whitehall, need to be aligned and brigaded to deliver. And that is very challenging. And that's the come back to Grant Shapps. I think it's impossible to lead that from a department that isn't the Treasury or somewhere close to number 10. So I think that the problem, if there is one, arises from the fact that if you don't have the political leadership at the top to do this grand thing, then sort of making it all happen is essentially an exercise in pushing lots of bits of string.
Yes or no answer. Do you think there should be a legal linkage between the EU and the UK's carbon trading schemes?
I absolutely think there should be linkages. It gives you far better.
Yes or no answer. Do you think they will?
I genuinely don't know. Actually, I think it's quite likely they won't.
Okay, good. Right, Mike's at the ready. Questions? Who would like to go first? Please tell us who you are before so we know who you are. Yeah. Do we have a mic? Yes, we do. Gentleman in the pinkish shirt.
Hi, Mark Williams, Energy UK. How should we think about the quasi-tax and spend system that we have in the form of environmental and social policies that is delivered off energy bills rather than actual taxes?
Who wants that one?
I think we really should talk about them as taxes, but that's effectively what they are. When I was at the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, when we did climate, I was lobbied all the time by green NGOs about why don't we have any taxes on energy? You said, have you not spotted that actually we have those, we just don't call them that anymore? And that's partly actually because one of the things that we do like in government is things that you can fool people into thinking aren't taxes by calling them other things. But that leads to a dishonest conversation. And there is a genuine discussion there, and we're going to see that whenever we get to the thing about rebalancing the tax treatment of gas and electricity, which was foreshadowed in the net zero strategy, and which I think the Treasury has now ducked out from postponing it a bit. When we talk about that, as where should those land? Should they land on electricity consumers, or should they land on general taxpayers, and should they land on gas consumers? Do we sort of just switch them across? So I think it's a really interesting thing, but I don't think it really helps public debate when you label things that very clearly are taxes. Also interesting things like feed-in tariffs. And feed-in tariffs are massively aggressive tax and transfer to poorer customers who couldn't afford to take out a loan and shove a bunch of photovoltaic cells on their roof to consumers who could. I mean, extremely sort of dodgy socially, even if very effective.
But if you take those away, what's the incentive to put the photovoltaic cells on the roof?
Well, when we had the feed-in tariff and used to get revenue back, it was the best savings account in town because it was basically 9% untaxed and being marketed at that, probably through the, how to spend it or whatever the FT now calls it, sort of blingy Saturday supplement.
HTSI.
One point on this, on the point on levies, we're having this, for those who follow it, big debate, I suppose, about what to do in response to the US and the Inflation Reduction Act and this kind of emerging narrative that the UK doesn't do industrial policy well. I would say the levy control framework, as it was once called, and whatever it's still called it, was a massive bit of industrial policy making. It was a George Osborne thing, and that's what supported the renewables transition that's been, is now an enormous industry in offshore wind. So we do it. It's just, as Bill says, we often try and hide it. And I mean, for what it's worth, in times of high fossil fuel prices, you absolutely should be thinking about whether you've got those levies on bills and whether it is clearly regressive to have them on bills, and it's clearly progressive to put it on general tax and spend. And once you take them off, it's very hard to put them back on again. So again, it's just another example of having to think in the round about all this properly and strategically. Otherwise, you've got this set of looming fiscal risks coming this way, never mind the net zero stuff. These are fiscal risks, that's what they should be looked at.
Okay, on next. Let's go to the other side of the room. The lady there, in the green at the back.
Hi there, Bea Natson from the Climate Change Committee. I'm curious about the trade-off between addressing the fiscal risk in terms of loss of revenue, and then if you do have a tax system that incentivises pro-environmental behaviours and to an extent penalises high-emitting behaviours, when you get to, say, 2050 net zero, you stop getting revenue from that. So how we deal with that challenge?
Oh, good one. Libby.
Well, I think so. First of all, on the looming fiscal hole from road pricing, I should have said this earlier. My colleagues have actually solved that. I was hoping to bring some of their reports, but they flew off the shelf and they weren't available in the office. But they've done an analysis of how you could do a fair share package for transport tax, and so address the 30-odd billion, 40-odd billion that we're going to lose from fuel taxes by implementing partially a road tax, but also kerosene tax on aviation fuel and shipping tax. And their estimation is that it would actually deliver slightly more as a percentage of tax take in 2025. But again, that will decrease if people stop driving, if people stop flying, as we want them to do. And so that is part of the purpose of having Treasury, like forcing Treasury to sit down and do a roadmap and for how the tax system is going to work. Because I suppose the last thing that you want, I'll just make one more point, is for Treasury to be incentivised to keep those high carbon, highly polluting activities in place, because it is a money spinner. And just as a slight observation, the most recent environmental tax that they've implemented, the plastics packaging tax, has actually exceeded the expectation of the revenue that it would bring in the first year. And what that, which is good for Treasury, I suppose, but what that means is that people aren't using as much recycled content as they had been anticipated, and the level of tax is high enough to bring in a lot of money, but not high enough to drive change.
That's interesting, really interesting. Jill?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. So I think, if you're looking at fuel duty, you're going to do some other way of taxing road use, and that will go on even when we're all bouncing around in electric cars or not. If people don't use
net, it's the same, right?
Yeah, if you don't use roads in the same way, then then maybe we'll have to find some different things and bits within the tax base shifts. I do think, though, on the things that are very explicitly addressing taxing, carbon and things like that, that even though it grieves me to say it as a sort of former Treasury person who viscerally hates hypothecation, there is actually an incredibly good case for hypothecating that to funding the net zero transition and the costs that people bear because of that transition. Because then actually, your revenue disappears as you cease to need it. And actually that means that your underlying fiscal balances are unaffected. So I think you need to think about actually where does that end you in the steady state tax system that you have in 2050.
On that, briefly, I mean, this is one of my lots of clever people always say, let's have a carbon tax and a carbon dividend. You hear that all the time. And this is always one of my worries, is that is a policy that is set up to fail. So in the end, because the recipient of that dividend, wherever they may lie in the distribution, will eventually not receive anything if they're successful in making this work. I do think that these sort of proposals are often set up to fail. I mean, I'm not a fan of the carbon tax and dividend.
Do you agree with Jill on the hypothecation?
I do, actually. I mean, I think that I similarly have a mindset that we shouldn't hypothecate, but I think on this occasion I can imagine that it would work quite well. And the problem with hypothecations is people always think there's one occasion when you should use it. But I'll give you an example. But the US did the Inflation Reduction Act I referred to earlier. The EU's response to that is a whole package of things which they will probably fund out of emissions trading scheme revenues, hypothecated to green stuff. And it's quite interesting, Brexit impact actually, that had the UK still been in the European Union, we would have prevented it. And it's quite interesting, the EU's whole response to the Inflation Reduction Act has now been opened up because UK is not in Europe any longer. So I think there is a role for presenting these things.
I think we would have prevented it in the light of IRA.
I do think we'd have prevented it because it's a bog standard Treasury outlook on everything is you don't hypothecate taxes. So I think it would have been knocked out.
And you also stop
And you think
any
we'd have been able to
expansion
prevent it?
to tax. I mean, that's an absolute article of faith in the Treasury that, if I'm not looking at the government departments on our tax system, it's certainly not letting the EU anywhere near it.
That's a good old hypothetical. Right, next question. Let's go to the gentleman in the blue shirt, right on the far side.
Thank you, Richard Barnes from the London Wildlife Trust. Libby, you mentioned landfill tax. Perhaps I'd as a recipient of landfill tax credit, I'd like some reassurance that it does seem to be a win-win, because on the one hand, the actual tax incentivises the circular economy, and lots of ENGOs, I've been there a year, and I'm on my third landfill tax credit grant at the Wildlife Trust. So is it as good as it sounds?
Just explain how and why you get that.
It's basically, you apply, if you're within 10 miles of a landfill site, you can apply for various things, like in this case it's infrastructure like boardwalks and bridges and things, access infrastructure to nature reserves. So it seems ostensibly a good one. I just want some reassurance that it's working as a green tax and I'm not just simply recycling money. But
What's the thinking behind that?
Well, so the landfill tax is the one that I mentioned before, and I am slightly going to burst your bubble.
Why are they spending landfill tax revenues building boardwalks?
So they're doing a bit of it's a bit of redistribution. It's an instance where they have been willing, and I don't know how it got through, but since it was implemented in the 1990s, they have been using some of the money that's raised through it to fund restoration projects and nature projects. And the landfill tax is good in many ways. It is definitely not perfect. In terms of achieving what it set out to achieve, which was to divert biological waste from landfill, it has been fantastic. Trouble is, almost all of that waste has gone directly into incineration, because the landfill tax has created a business model where the only way you can make money out of resources, it's not recycling, it's not preventing waste, it's incinerating it, because that's the only other option apart from landfill. That's not to say that's an insurmountable problem, but it shows again that you do need to look at tax changes in the round, and you need to evaluate the environmental and behaviour changes that are caused by them. And that's actually not even routinely done for environmental taxes, and it's not done for those taxes that don't have an explicit environmental purpose. And that's a real problem, because the tax system is driving actions, and they're not always the actions that you want.
Chris,
I don't have too much to say on that, except that the perverse incentives that come with these very specific tax measures always bring these things. So I mean, the more that we can be strategic about shifting incentives, the better, really, and not getting into specific tax by tax, incentive by incentive.
Right, on to our next. Fastest on the draw, gentleman down here.
Hi, George Day from the Energy Systems Catapult. Peter, you talked about the siloing of the issues, and it strikes me that one of the real difficulties is how to get a really joined up debate and understanding of the issues, because tax is only sort of one lever that you can use to put a price on carbon or to put an economic driver behind decarbonisation. And Chris has mentioned some of the others, like, there was the levy control framework, or there's standards and obligations as well, which you can use to drive relative price changes between, say, low carbon or high carbon choices. So there's a whole, and it's quite a complex area to analyse and actually really understand what's the effective carbon price in particular activities or sectors of the economy. So I'm wondering, how do we get, a much better holistic understanding of that, not just focus on just tax. Tax is one lever, but there's all these others as well. And could we, say, persuade the IFS or somebody like that to do, an annual analysis of this?
Isn't that your job, Chris?
Well, plug for some work that we're doing right now. So, but we're going to produce something probably at the start of next year, which is, you could think of as a sort of calculator to look at the policy packages and to look at the distributional impact and the fairness impact of those policy packages. And it's a very crude thing to do that, because it takes you into not just taxes, but also where we're putting grant subsidies into things, what you do with obligations, various taxes and duties are in play, of course, but also just straightforward public spending. But I think we can do it. We've got quite a nice way of characterising various interventions that look particularly at the big challenges which are in the transport system and in the housing market. Energy as well is in there too, but I think you can do something like that. I don't really know what you do to answer your question, George, but I quite liked what Jill suggested. I think having some sort of cross-party consensus to look at this would be great now, actually. And you could have, can you imagine I don't know whether it's a Royal Commission or something that actually looked more fundamentally at the tax system. But that has been tried before with the Murley's review. There's always a kind of thing that intervenes that causes it not to be the right moment. I think that, I'll go back to what I said at the start of this, the fact that there is 40, 50 billion a year at stake is a reason to do this, even if you don't care about net zero. So, and my opening point that there is an inevitability to this transition is the key thing. It's not really policy driven anymore. People are going to be driving electric cars whether the government likes it or not. So, that you don't need to frame it as solely the result of the government's decision to sign up to net zero. Although I think that is a sensible way to look at it.
I mean, Merley's is obviously different because Merley's was commissioned by the IFS rather than by government. So it didn't have, it was a bit of private enterprise by the IFS, and went, I fear it's a similar way to the Mead Commission 40 years earlier, which also produced things and then got a bit ignored. As a sort of economists tell you what a proper tax system should look like, and everybody goes, but we're not going to do that. I do think it's quite an interesting bit of potential extra sort of machinery or maybe collaboration, which we've been kicking around as an idea, and I think the Danes do something, which is to have a bit of sort of interaction potentially through the Office of Budget Responsibility, which does the sort of fiscal risks and assesses some of those sorts of sides, and the Climate Change Committee to say, actually, could they come together and at some time assess, if you like, the economic efficiency of the way in which we're managing the transition. I do think that would be a useful addition to the sort of panoply of sort of guidance that we have that might build the pressure for slightly better policy making.
Chris, that's an interesting idea. I mean, you think the OBR has almost kind of godlike status, its ability to be the arbiter of truth. Would that give you? I mean, you've harried hard in various places, but would it give you extra heft, as it were, if it was kind of bound in with the wider economic piece?
I think it would, and I think it's important to say that the Treasury is content for us to push towards more cooperation with the OBR. I don't think we should be the OBR in this area, so that there is a really important role for the OBR to get the private side of fiscal decisions where they're taking. But there is finding a collective view across OBR and CCC about some of these strategic issues. I think you could do. The challenge, I think, with the OBR is that they necessarily use quite crude measures of what the transition looks like, and as do other institutions, notably the Bank of England. So I think getting into slightly more detail about what the nature of these risks I've been referring to is, and what the opportunity is to deliver a fairer outcome that looks beyond just tax decisions into broader fiscal questions, and crucially draws in the question of whether you might be more efficient to set a standard in that sector and allow the private sector to deliver it rather than trying to do it through public spending and tax. I think we can help with some of that. So I think that is quite an appealing vision of how you might go forward on this, where fiscal decisions at the very least have had some kind of there's a consensus about how the OBR and the CCC might view those decisions.
Interesting. Agree with that, Libby?
I think that would be great.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Right. We've got time for a couple more. We did start late. We've got another 5 minutes. Let's go right to the back of the room. Gentleman in the white shirt, and then we'll come across to you, madam, in the blue dress. Yes.
So, changing any type of tax obviously requires a lot of public support.
Just tell us who you are.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Alex Guns from Medina Communications. Obviously, changing tax and adjuncting tax and fiddling with tax, whatever you want to call it, requires a lot of public support, especially with climate issues being so forefront in public discourse. How would you bring the public on side, especially with lots of helpful, unhelpful, and anti-green campaigns currently in the wider political space?
Yeah, but you work for a campaigning green organisation. Tell us how you're going to bring the people on side.
I do think a lot of what we heard from the people in the work that we did is that they don't believe that the government is doing the right thing. They don't trust that they're doing the right thing. So if they make changes to the tax system without it seeming like a coherent whole, they're not going to like them. So I think there is a lot more the government should be doing, not just in the Treasury, but across the board, in establishing a track record of being consistent and having the policies in place to get people's trust that they're going to do the right thing, including when it comes to taxes.
And how do you do that?
Well, you don't do things.
It's a profound observation, but you're empress for the day. How do you do that?
So you don't chop and change the things that you're going to do. Like I feel like the Green Home Grant, which I think you mentioned earlier, that was a disaster, and that caused a lot of dithering, a lot of delay, a lot of having nothing in place to help people make their homes greener. And so I think the policy changes that we've had in the past have really not helped, and it is difficult to erase that track record and establish trust. But I do think that being more consistent with what they say, actually having a plan to get to net zero that isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet, as some of my other colleagues would say, that would be quite helpful. And I think I had another point, but I forgot it.
But Chris, I mean, well, that touches on a really much more profound point about being strategic, etc. But by definition, it's a generational project. 25 years to 2050 to net zero. No, I make you emperor for the day. How do we move the conversation into saying this is actually a non-political thing? This is about the survival of the planet, of all of us, and actually. What we're talking about is not a 5-year cycle thing. We're talking about something that we're all collectively committed to, which at some level, except for a really kind of increasingly minor loony bin fringe, actually it's accepted we need to get there. How do we create a kind of environment where this whole discussion somehow breaks free of the political cycle?
I mean, I think we're almost there, actually. I mean, one of the really interesting things in my role is to take this long view on how we reached where we are today. I quite often spend time talking about the Climate Change Act that we have. This country, because it has a Climate Change Act and because of the nature of the political discussion, has probably the best foresight of any place in the world of what this transition looks like. To the point where we're talking not just about a numerical target that we've got to hit in 2050, but also what that would entail in some detail in every corner of the economy. We call those pathways. There are choices within those pathways, but as you progress along, the choices diminish, actually. So the kind of interesting thing is, could you work with that a bit more and present this not as a 2050 thing, as it often is presented, but as a literally, year by year, month by month thing, which is literally what we have. You've got to set up a transition, a sense of a transition actually taking place. Then you can have a discussion about how the tax system might be moulded and amended into the future. I would like to see us be more Scandinavian about some of that. So I think the duty should be on government to say, in outline at least, what the options are as that transition takes place. The Scandinavian countries are much better at that, actually. They say, in 10 years' time, the tax system might have to be amended in the following ways, which builds a better consensus about how some of that might take place. We have the apparatus to do that. We are locked into legal targets that imply these legal pathways. The government itself has signed up to those pathways and made them part of their net zero strategy. So it's not I don't think it's a surprise that this stuff is happening. It's the government's intention that it should. So the weirdness is that we can't have a discussion of what fiscal policy and tax policy particularly will deliver along the way. But that's possible, surely. I mean, I think that's the way forward.
So I just want to make a plea for better tax literacy as a starting point.
We'd have a team program about that.
If you look at the Chancellor Rishi Sunak a couple of years ago in his budget pushed through some massive tax rises, and he did it 2 ways. Corporation taxes, Libby says, people, you could do the pure theory of corporation tax time and time again, which Chris no doubt did, at the inland revenue, which says that actually corporations don't pay tax, ultimately some person do, either employees or shareholders, which is true, but people think corporations pay, so you can get away with a massive hike in corporation tax. Ditto, freeze tax allowances through fiscal drag, massive increase in taxes, whatever, but you can get away with it because it's, you don't get the headlines screaming that you would if you did exactly the same, was it 4 pence or income tax rates? I mean, our press is appalling, with the notable exception of Financial Times, of course, in reporting tax changes or whatever. So I think you need to get to a situation where actually you're prepared to sort of give people some sort of, interesting home truths as chancellors. Chancellors should not assume that they're in that job to be popular, and actually say, look, this is what we're doing and these are why these are the best choices for the economy. You just have to sort of trust your parties and your people and not focus group yourself into complete inactivity environment. Focus group how you communicate the change you know needs to be made rather than ask people what we should be doing.
You're totally right, Jill, that the reporting on tax and stuff is rubbish, thank God for the IFS, but I tell you what, the government's perennially, underhand and dishonest way it communicates really doesn't help, right? It's hard enough as it is, trust me, on budget day, right? But it drives me insane, right? That they literally try and lead people astray, and then they go, oh, the spring runs about tax. Come on. Right, I can see tantalisingly over there glistening glasses of red and white wine. I did promise this lady one question.
Damn it, I thought I was going to make a comment as well as ask a question. My name's Barbara Young, I'm a member of the House of Lords, and I'm on the Environment and Climate Change Select Committee, and also chair the Labour Climate and Environment Forum. The point I want to make before I ask the question is the whole issue of what we know about the public. The Select Committee did a report on behaviour change, public behaviour change for climate and the environment, and it was absolutely staggering how clear the public were. What they said was, tell us what the 4 simple things are that we need to do, and tell us how you're going to make them cheaper and easier. And that was absolutely coming from everybody, right across the socio-economic and national and other spectrums. And so for me, the whole thing is about this narrative, about how you actually get a narrative and the public debate going that keeps on banging away at meeting that need that they've so clearly expressed. So the question really is, if the Americans can do this commingling of policy thing that they appear to do so much better than us in the Inflation Reduction Act, why are we not able to do it? What would the pitch rolling need to look like to get that to be an acceptable way forward in the face of real public support for doing the right thing, if only they could find a simple way of doing it?
It's a very good question. Forgive me for not recognising, I need my bifocals on. Why can't we do it? I mean, obviously, the quantum is not the issue here, but in the principle, why do we struggle to meld those two things together?
Just, I suppose this is a good opportunity to stick the boot in, and I do think it doesn't help that Treasury is so powerful and so focused on the short term and on raising funds and not on investing in the long term. And I had a really interesting conversation with someone who's involved in British Volt, which obviously had a bit of investment but not enough, about the problems with the current government's approach. And she said she's not in favour of subsidies, and obviously the UK government doesn't do as many subsidies, isn't following along the lines of the Inflation Reduction Act. But that approach only works if also nobody else does subsidies and invests in the sorts of things that they want to see. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on why that's the case, but just an observation that it...
I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act is just fascinating. The reason I find it so interesting is because it's a massive experiment, actually. I mean, you don't really know what it's going to do. And Giles Wilkes, who some of you might know, he's a special advisor and writes very well on it. He's at the IFG now. He really kind of, I think, wrote a fantastic thing about how we do industrial policy very badly in the UK and how the US can come along and spend all this money on it. And then I read Adam Two's, his take on Inflation Reduction, and he says they're not spending enough. So it's a kind of interesting, it's not even, that's not big enough. I think we could do an Inflation Reduction Act. But the fundamental problem with it in this country is that we don't tend to do these mass experiments like that, these kind of big open-ended checks. There are some interesting protections in it. One of the ways that the US does this, firstly, worth knowing, the Inflation Reduction Act is a product of the US political machine. Congress cannot pass a climate bill. The only way to do it is with a piece of fiscal legislation, because you can get it through in a simple majority, and therefore they're pushed into doing this. But it's got some quite interesting features because of all that. Nick Stern, who many of you will know, I spoke to him not long after it was in. He was telling me he was doing a piece of work right now on the kind of notion behind it, which is that production subsidies, largely what's in it is production subsidies, might be the most effective way through this. Like, just throwing money at it is not a bad idea, actually. And the way that the US would put some protection around it is to say, well, in some areas, we're not just throwing money at it, we're saying you can have the money and an open-ended check as long as you hit a particular price for whatever the thing is being produced, which is a way of introducing innovation and competition into it. So we could do that. And yes, there will be some, there'll be a lot of open-ended checks and This is not the kind of typical UK-based, very precise intervention, but it moves everything on in a way that we have not done for a long time, actually, maybe since the levy control framework in this country. And I think it would be nice, I think, to see the courage to do something like that. I think it will matter. And my final point on this is it kind of doesn't matter what the quantum of it is, actually. What matters is that every boardroom in the land here in the UK who has some interest in the US is now thinking about the US, not the UK. So it's a sort of, it's not a logical thing, but that's just the way it works.
The speed of that change is just
astonishing. It's astonishing. We were not having this discussion a year ago about in that way.
Yeah.
But it's clear that this now is quite a big dividing line between the political parties. If you heard Ed Miliband speak at Green Alliance, who was extremely positive about the Inflation Reduction Act. Jeremy Hunt made clear that he doesn't think it's the right way. So I think that's it opening up as quite interesting fault line. Of course, it's much easier to do things that involve very large scale borrowing if you're in a country which has a reserve currency than one who has a slightly dodgy reputation at the moment with financial markets, has to slightly manage a bit carefully there, so we may not be able to do scale. But I think it's really interesting to see the way in which the parties are shaping up to react both to the Inflation Reduction Act and to what's going on in the EU with the UK trying to find its rather difficult niche. And as Chris said, the EU wouldn't be doing what the EU is doing if the UK had stayed a member. Maybe in the long run that opens the way to a more productive relationship between the UK and the EU realise that there are benefits from the UK no longer being inside, because they can develop in a different way. So I think it's really interesting to watch this space area to see what pressure it brings to the UK to sort of do its own version of that. And I think that would be a big contested area at the next election.
Right, it's definitely drink time. I thought that was a really fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, panel. Give them a round of applause.